All right. Hey, welcome. Feel free to grab coffee. Come in and join us. Hey, Bob, are microphones on? Working out our techie issues. Working today. All right. We're going to go ahead and get started. We have a lot of information to share today. And so, Bob, what's wrong? Okay. All right. So thank you guys so much. We've got a small group here in person. We've got a pretty large group that's gathering on Facebook. So I'm glad that you guys are able to join us in both capacities. We are going to talk through today about a year's worth of data that we have been collecting in our community. So what we are going to be talking about is the adverse childhood experiences and the long-term impact that they have on our community specifically. There's a lot of data, there's a lot of information about ACEs, but what we really wanted to do was not just go off of national data, international data, other communities' data. We thought it would be really interesting to dig in and do some of that research right here in Springfield. And so one of the things that has been a big burden for me ever since we started TCG, and even before that, is just the long-term, lifelong impact of trauma, right? A lot of times we have conversations about childhood trauma, but we don't always carry that conversation through to how much that impacts people as they get into adulthood and in relationships and holding down a job and all of those kind of things. And so I came across this this quote recently, and it has just really stuck with me as we've done this data. And it was from Robert Bloch, who is the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And he said this. He said, "ACEs are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today." And what I hope you see as we talk through this is, one, how that is true, especially here in our community. But two, I don't think it's just the greatest unaddressed public health threat. I think it's also the greatest unaddressed social health threat, social services threat. It is the greatest health threat, the greatest threat, period, to our ability to survive and to thrive in the context of community. And so we're going to kind of go through all of this today. Everything that you see up here is going to be uploaded onto our website about 10 minutes after we're done. So it's all there. We're just going to hit the button. So you'll be able to engage with all of these slides and see everything a little bit better. And I know some of them are a little bit hard to see, and I apologize for that. So Holly's going to kind of explain to you real quick before we jump into the numbers themselves, kind of what our process was as we collected these interviews over the last year.
Hey everybody, I'm Holly Madden. I work here at the Connecting Grounds as a Family Connection Director, and I got to be a part of this process of helping to interview people. So the process was that we interviewed people over the course of last year, so over 2020. We interviewed about 200 individuals who are between the ages of 15 and 72. And these were people who are living here in Springfield, Missouri. They are individuals that we met at some different outreaches that we do here at Connecting Grounds. So we had a huge percentage that we did at our community outreach center, which is over on 3000 West Chestnut. These are individuals who can come and access resources, who have a need for some basic items like clothing, food, or a need to connect with resources in our community. A large population of those are people that are living on the streets of our city. We were able to connect with people via street outreach. And so something we do at Connecting Grounds is we do street outreach every evening when it is cold outside, when that temperature is below 40 degrees. So we regularly check on people. And then in the summer, we also check on them regularly, about once a week, some of our people that are living in camps to make sure they have what they need to survive. And so we interviewed people on those outreach events. We regularly serve dinner at the Veterans Coming Home Center, which, if you're not familiar with that, that's the only day shelter right now in our city for those who have no place to go. And so we do help provide meals and other necessities there. And so during those meals, we did pull some people aside and were able to survey them. And then lastly, we did through Family Connection, which is the program that I have the privilege of running. And that's a program where we supervise visits for families that are in the foster care system. So we work to advocate and support parents that are working to reunify with their children. And about 80% of the families we work with are considered unsheltered, where they are not living in a place that's their own. Almost all of them do live below the poverty line. And so that was really who we gathered that 200 individuals from. Each person was interviewed by a TCG staff member, and so there was a lot of consistency, and that form was a very, it was the same form everyone got, so all answers were based off of the same exact material that they were getting. And then we took all of that and were able to calculate that, we were able to assess that, and that's what you're gonna see up on the slides today.
Yes, lots of late night nerdy math. All right, so here's kind of how these ACEs break down. There's 10 ACEs that are nationally recognized from the first initial study that measured kind of these indicators. These childhood traumas seem to have a huge impact on people's health, mentally, physically, emotionally, their ability to form healthy relationships and connections. So I'm gonna kind of walk these through with you and show you what our population here in Springfield, these initial 200 people, what percentage of them experienced these 10 ACEs. And then we'll talk about the overall cumulative score. All right, so the first one is emotional abuse. And out of the 200 individuals that we interviewed, 71.5% identified as someone who had experienced emotional abuse in their first 18 years of life. The second one is physical abuse. And of those groups, 58% said that they had experienced physical abuse at some point in their life before the age of 18. The third one is sexual abuse. And as we talked through this with people, again, we walked this through with them in conversation with a staff member because we also recognize this can be a really triggering process just to capture those ACE scores. So we talked through a lot of these. The sexual abuse score was 45% of the people that we talked to. The fourth ACE that is measured typically is poverty and the impact of poverty and living and growing up in poverty before the age of 18. And of the people that we interviewed, 51.5% identified as individuals who had grown up in or around poverty. The fifth one is neglect. And so neglect is a wide variety of things, right? It's often poverty adjacent. It's often things like maybe not having access to good hygiene all the time. Maybe it's not feeling loved or appreciated by parents all the time because sometimes they were having to work multiple jobs or they were really stressed out about different things. Neglect is kind of a very broad category. But of the individuals we interviewed, 52.5% identified as having experienced neglect growing up. The sixth ACE that is measured in this study is separated parents. So this can be parents that are divorced and those parents aren't together anymore. It can also be kids that are separated from their parents for some reason, whether that's through foster care or through some other circumstance. So 59.5% of this group of people identified as people who had separated parents. The next one is children who witness the female caregiver in their life. It says mother, but it can also be grandmother. It can be an aunt if they live with an aunt who is actively being the victim of physical assault, is actively being the victim of domestic violence in some capacity. That can be physical, sexual, emotional. But if a child is witnessing their primary female caregiver being abused in their home, and 38% of the individuals that we interviewed for this study said that they grew up in a home where they saw their primary female caregiver being abused. The eighth ACE that is measured is alcohol use or drug use in the home. So at any point that was used regularly or even incidentally, but consistently, right? So it may not have had to be every day, but it was definitely a consistent force in the home. 63% of the people that we interviewed said that they grew up in a home that had alcohol and drug use regularly. The ninth ACE that is measured in this study is mental health history in the family. So if your parents struggle with mental health, if your brothers and sisters struggle with mental health, if your grandparents struggle with mental health, this is really kind of immediate family, people that are involved in your upbringing struggle with mental health. And of the individuals that we interviewed, 61.5% identified as having mental health history in their home. And then the final ACE that is traditionally measured in this study is family members that are incarcerated, family members that are in jail, because there's a lot of unique factors that come with being jailed and being imprisoned, and a lot of unique traumas that come with that, and a lot of things that we're exposed to that we're not exposed to in just a normal separation experience. 37% of the individuals we interviewed for this study identified as people who had a family member in jail. So when we add all of that together, the cumulative ACE score for the 200 individuals that we interviewed on the streets of Springfield was 5.38. 5.38. And so if we break that down by gender identity, you can see our women that we interviewed had a little bit higher score altogether than our gentlemen. So our women had a 5.65 ACE score altogether, and our gentlemen had a 4.88 ACE score altogether. So what does this mean? Let me give you a little bit of context for this. Here are some things that national data has showed us, okay? This has been studied for decades now. And so for decades, we have had individuals in the medical field, the mental health field, lots of different fields who have been looking and tracking the long-term impact that ACEs have on individuals. And the higher your ACE score, the higher the experiences you may have growing up that are problematic, difficult, and the barriers that you may experience to success and to the ability to thrive. So when we see someone who has an ACE score of 4 or higher, like this cumulative score for this community was, an ACE score of 4 or more significantly increases the risk of 7 out of the 10 leading causes of adult death. That includes heart disease, stroke, cancer, COPD, diabetes, Alzheimer's, and suicide. It breaks down to show us that individuals with an ACE score of 4 or more, they are 2 times more likely to develop heart disease, 2 times more likely to have a stroke, 3 times more likely to contract hepatitis in their lifetime. They are 4 times more likely to be a tobacco user, a smoker. They are 5 times more likely to develop depression. They are 7 times more likely to become an alcoholic. They are 10 times more likely to use IV drugs. And they are 12 times more likely to attempt to take their own life. So it is really critical that we understand this. We also see that an ACE score of 4 or more also means they're more likely to misuse prescription medications. They are more likely to be violent. They are more likely to have marriage problems, and they're more likely to have broken bones, which often can be because of high-risk behaviors and things like that that are happening. And so this information, okay, that has been garnered over the decades from lots of different sources, many medical sources, many mental health professionals have all kind of pooled this data together and have agreed that when we start to see ACE scores of 4 or more, it has a significant long-term impact on an individual's ability to just kind of get ahead in things, that these ACEs really have a long-lasting impact. We know that it literally changes our brain chemistry, changes the way that our brains are wired, it changes our body chemistry, how we respond to things, our ability to trust people, and so it has an incredible impact, and you're gonna see more of that impact as we go through these numbers. But another thing that we did in this study, and I'm gonna have Holly go through this with you, is we also broke down by age groups. And so it's really fascinating because here's what I think we start to see in this information is the generational impact of kids growing up in trauma. So Holly, will you kind of talk about this?
Yeah, so of those 200 individuals we saw, we did see several who were at that age of 25 and below. So the average ACE score for the over age 26 was 5.22, which is above that 4 number. The average ACE score for 25 years old and below is 7.2, which is insanely high. Of these kiddos, these young adults, we saw 100% of them said that they had experienced emotional abuse before the age of 18. 90% of them had said they had experienced physical abuse before the age of 18. 75% reported sexual abuse. 75% also Hello? 75%, oh, we lost our sound. Hello?
Talk really loudly.
Okay, I'm gonna talk really loudly. 75% also said that they had experienced some form of neglect And then another 75% had said that they had experienced separated parents or separation from parents. 50% said that they had experienced poverty growing up. 55% experienced their mother having been abused in their home. 65% experienced drug and alcohol use in home. 80% experienced mental health history in their family, and 55% experienced a family member in jail while they were growing up. And a lot of the significance that we see to that is that, like what Christy said, the generational trauma. Trauma is passed down from generations, and when there is not resources, when an individual does not access those resources, when there is not healing and things like that being done in the home by those parents, they pass on that to their children, whether they intend to or not. And then those children often experience even higher degrees of trauma. And so what we're seeing right now is a massive crisis in our city. Most of the kids that we do work with pretty regularly, come with a foster care background. They come having run away from homes that were abusive but have stayed outside of the system. And at such young ages, they are at such high risk of developing a lot of these really long-term health. Okay, just in case it comes back on. Okay. And so we're going to look at what does it mean if an individual has an ACE score of 7 or higher. So Christy kind of shared the 4 or higher. 7 or higher is considered a very high number. Scores of 6 or higher died nearly 20 years earlier on average than those without ACE scores or with very low ACE scores. So 3 or below is considered a low ACE score. So 20 years on average is the lifespan that is lost with an ACE score of 7. An ACE score of 7, even if those who do not drink, smoke, or overeat, are 360% more likely to develop heart disease than someone without or with low ACEs. Scores of 7 are higher have a 100% chance of developing a mental illness diagnosis, with anxiety and depression being the most common. That's 100%. That means that there is no one with an ACE score of 7 or higher that does not develop some sort of diagnosable mental health condition. ACE scores of 7 or higher are more likely to bounce between jobs, relationships, and to struggle with stability and consistency. We see this quite a bit. People who do not have spoons is a word used with chronic health conditions, the mental capacity, even the coping skills to be able to handle a job consistently, to be able to stay in a healthy relationship, to be able to parent their children in a healthy manner. We see a lot of these individuals who do lose their kiddos to the system. And who just often struggle to stay in housing, to stay in places where they're consistent and they're stable. Also staying consistent with support systems. And lastly, ACE scores of 7 or higher have less than a 50% chance of graduating high school, and that percentage is even lower for graduating any kind of continuing education courses, which also includes trade school.
So here's what I want to do for us. I want to connect some dots. Okay, so with an ACE score of 5.2 for this cumulative population that we interviewed of 200 individuals, I want to share with you kind of what we did on this survey was we put together a whole bunch of outcomes, right? And we asked them, which of these outcomes have you experienced in your life, so that we could really start to kind of connect the dots a little bit between that childhood trauma, that ACE score, and things that we're still continuing to experience or have experienced as an adult. So here's a few of these numbers that I want to share with you. I want to share with you that 91.5% of the individuals that we interviewed have experienced homelessness, which is an incredibly high number. 100% of them have lived in poverty at some point in their life. 57.5% have had a diagnosed mental health issue. 89.5% have been a tobacco user at some point in their life. 66.5% have been an alcohol user at some point in their life. 40% have been an IV drug user at some point in their life. You want to go through the rest?
77.5% use other drugs that are not IV. 63% have spent time in jail. 30.5% have spent time in prison. 13% have developed cancer. 20% have dealt with STDs. 13.5% deal with diabetes. 85.5% have diagnosable or their own diagnosed version of depression. 80.5% report anxiety. 14% have a history of strokes, and that is across the age range. 12.5% deal with liver disease. 41.5% have high blood pressure. 41.5 have experienced divorce or have been divorced, and that number we consider to be extremely low as well, because in circles of poverty, people are less likely to actually get legally married. And so we see actually both the reverse of that. Some people who are very committed in relationships and will call each other husband and wife and have been together for a very long time, but have never pursued the legal paperwork, mostly because of money and time. But then that on the other side of it is we see a lot of people who have been separated from their who they would consider to be a spouse, but they won't call it divorce because they were never legally married. 50% have a history of evictions on their record. 43.5% report domestic violence. And then the highest grade level completed for this population was 11th grade. As an average. And so as an average, most of these individuals, all right, I guess I don't know how to say that. There's a huge percentage of them that never graduated high school.
Or did their GEDs.
The age of the first sexual experience average was 14, which would equate to be about an 8th or 9th grader. And then 31.5% have children in foster care. And I will also add to this statistic that there is a very high percentage of parents who are separated from their children, but they are not in foster care. And that would be because of a different biological parent who has full custody of those children, or they're living with grandparents or parents and they've done that outside of the system. But it is still considered separation, but that is a very underreported number as well.
So I want to kind of walk you through the average length of homelessness that we saw with this question, because one of the questions we asked them was not only have you experienced homelessness, but how long have you been on the streets? And this number is going to be really interesting here in a little bit when we compare it to a different number. So people who reported 0 to 3 months of homelessness, there were 10 of them in this study. 3 to 6 months of homelessness, there were 8 of them. 6 to 11 months, there were 10. 1 year of homelessness was 25. 3 to 4 years of homelessness was 25. 17 people reported being homeless 4 to 5 years. 14 people reported being homeless 5 to 6 years. 7 people reported being homeless 6 to 7 years. 4 people reported 7 to 8 years. 3 people reported 8 to 9 years, and 21 individuals, 10%, reported that they had been homeless over 10 years, which means that the average length of homelessness in our community is just shy of 4 years at 42 months. And I want you to just imagine that, because one of the things we talk about a lot is how there is a very narrow window of time. When people are coming out onto the streets for the very first time, there is a narrow window where if we can get supportive services wrapped around them, we can make sure that they have an ID, we can make sure that they've got access to resources and to help, we are more likely to get them off the streets in those early few months than if we start to stretch into the longer half of that. Because as we start to stretch into the longer half of that, our ability to just have hope and to keep trying, I kind of equate it to someone who's drowning, right? Like when you are first struggling in the water, you get a cramp or something, you are flailing with everything that you have, and you're grabbing a hold of anything and everything because you do not want to go down, right? And we see that in individuals that have been on the street for really less than 5 months. It's kind of when I tend to see that. But we start to get past that and something happens and we just lose energy. It becomes harder and harder to keep fighting, and eventually people just start to kind of float in that space to try to keep their heads above water as long as they can. Something else that is really important, and Holly's gonna go through this, is a statistic that we asked them was, in the time period of 0 to 18, how many positive people did you have in your life? And this question and this answer really broke my heart.
Well, and I'll start by saying that there is research that proves that positive people in someone's life is the #1 factor for people being able to heal the trauma that has been in their lives, to actually rewire their brain. And so that is normally the factor that is the most important factor for people who have high trauma when they're children. And so the average score that we saw for the people we interviewed had an average of only 1.56 positive people in their life growing up. And this is between the ages of infancy to 18 years old. The adult average was 1.55. Youth average was less than that, 1.35. For males, there was a report of 1.57 on average, and females was even lower, 1.53 on average. And what's really important to acknowledge is that someone who has a high ACE score, they are not doomed. It is not a sentence that they won't be able to be successful, that they won't be able to heal. That is not the case at all. But what really impacts those individuals is the amount of people they have in their life who champion them, who believe in them, who offer them opportunities, who kind of help support them as they engage in some different areas and different experience and different pursuits of goals and dreams and hopes and barrier breakers. And so oftentimes people who do report higher numbers of positive people end up in better situations in their life. Statistically, this is a national research that's done. And typically with the more positive people, they're exposed to even more positive people. And so what's been really heartbreaking is that of these 200 people we see who are daily struggling to survive, many struggling to just exist, just trying to find a safe place to shelter, they reported a very, very low number. And typically when you have a low number as a child, you will continue to have a low number of those positive support system people in your life as an adult.
So do you guys see that connection between those health outcomes and those high ACE scores, and that connection between overall social issues and high ACE scores? So here's what we decided to do. We could have just stopped there, right? But what we wanted to do also was to have something to compare that data to. We wanted to see what it would look like to compare these numbers to a similar number of sheltered individuals who had been sheltered most of their lives. Some of them have experienced homelessness. You'll see that in the numbers, but not quite the same amount. And so I want to kind of show you, we interviewed 136 individuals. We did this through an online link for sheltered individuals. We sent it out to a lot of different people and asked them to participate. We ended up with respondents. We had an average age of 44.06 was the average age of the respondents who took the online survey. 74.5 of those were female, 23.5% of those were male, 2% of those identified as non-binary. The average ACE score for those who were sheltered at the time that they were asked these questions, 2.59. Significantly lower by 3 points than the individuals that we interviewed throughout outreach settings over the last year. One of the things that we kind of walked through with this was their average yearly income for individuals that we asked to take the online sheltered survey was $66,733. I'm going to show you a comparison number here in a few minutes to that number. But here's the number that really gets us. The average number of positive people in those individuals' lives on that survey was 9.86. A much higher number of people that they felt like believed in them, saw them, encouraged them, were willing to go out of their way to help them, that they felt like they had someone that they could call if they were struggling or if they were in trouble in any way. So I'm going to let Holly kind of walk through a few of these other pieces that we saw from the sheltered survey.
The average grade completed of those who took our online survey was 16.52. I'm not sure what that equates to, but it's college degree. So the majority of the people that were completing this had completed some college, if not multiple degrees of higher education. The first average age of their first sexual experience was 18.5. So that was a jump from that 14 number that we talked about. 91.1% said that they have a savings account. 93.3% reported having health insurance, and 99.3% said they do not have children in foster care. So the majority of those that we worked with had not ever experienced their children being in foster care.
So let's look at those numbers side by side, because I think this is where we really start to have some aha moments. So the average ACE score of those that were housed at the time that they took this survey, 2.59. Our outreach interview, 5.38. So the average number of positive people, and you compare those side by side, almost 10 people as compared to 1.5 people. The yearly income, $66,733 for our sheltered individuals. Our average income when we interviewed those 200 people in outreach settings was $3,708 for the year. And so it averaged out that there were a handful of people who had disability or had a full-time, part-time job, but the vast majority of individuals did not have a consistent form of income. Average grade completion, you're looking at past a bachelor's degree for our sheltered individuals. You're looking at the vast majority who struggled to finish high school with our outreach interviews. That first sexual experience numbers, if we work with youth in any capacity, right, this number is critically important looking at this difference. You're looking at the difference between an 18-year-old and a 14-year-old. Foster care involvement, like Holly said, those numbers are huge. You look at the percentage of homelessness. For people that were sheltered, they reported only 9.6% of them had ever experienced homelessness at any point in their life, while 91.5% had said they had experienced homelessness. The length of homelessness is the number that I think gets me the most. Our sheltered interviews, they said that the average length that they were on the streets was 7.2 months. Whereas our individuals that we interviewed in that outreach setting, that average time of being on the streets was almost 4 years. And I'm a big believer that the thing that makes a difference in that situation is having positive, supportive people that can go to you, that can check on you, that you can go to for help, places whose houses you can stay at. People will help you get on top of things and get back on top of things. The poverty numbers are also interesting. That housing interview, 28.1% said they had experienced poverty, whereas 100% of our outreach interviews had experienced poverty. When we talk about savings accounts, 89.8% of our individuals that were housed had a savings account, where only 14.5% of individuals that we interviewed in the outreach setting had a savings account. Health insurance, Elisa, this one's for you. 95.8% of sheltered interviews said that they had health insurance, while only 43% of our outreach interviews. Now, if we would have done this survey a year ago prior to Medicaid expansion in Missouri, this number would have been incredibly lower, much, 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 much lower. And so we have seen a huge jump, and a big part of that is thanks to the efforts of a lot of great community organizations and volunteers who have been plugging away outreach, Medicaid expansion applications as fast as they can, because really we have a chance to close this gap right now thanks to legislation that is now currently at risk once again. So let's look at some of these outcomes as compared. Those numbers I gave you of like homelessness, drug use, alcohol use. I want to show you these side by side with our outreach interviews and our sheltered interviews.
For those who reported having no negative outcomes for the sheltered surveys, it was 6.7%, which is still a considerable amount of people who've not had any negative outcomes. On the outreach side, no one reported having so every single person we talked to had some negative outcome in their adult life. Those who have used tobacco in their adult life rely on tobacco dependency. 36.3% of those who are sheltered reported using tobacco as a negative outcome, while almost 90% of those on the outreach side of things rely on tobacco or have relied on tobacco. Alcohol use, same thing, about 38.5% in the sheltered surveys, 66.5% on the outreach side of things. IV drug use, which is a very scary form of drug use. We said 3.7% of those sheltered had experienced and used IV drugs. 40% of those on outreach reported using IV drugs. And other forms of drug use, only 28.1% on the sheltered side of things, 77.5% on outreach reported drug use.
You see these huge jumps in these numbers, and I hope that those are grabbing you, because they really grabbed us as we kind of walked through this. I shared with you homelessness already, but I'm going to jump down to the next one on this next slide, which is the number of evictions. So of those sheltered individuals, only 8.9% in the online interview self-reported that they had experienced evictions, whereas 50% of our outreach interview had experienced an eviction at some point in their life. Let's talk about evictions for a second. Why is that number so important? Because in Missouri, evictions do not fall off of your record. So if you have a history of an eviction, it can be 10, 15 years ago. We still see that being a negative determinant for you trying to get into housing in the future. So if things fell apart, you were in a domestic violence situation, something was going on in your life, you lost your job, you lost that first house, that place, it is so much more difficult for you to get back into another lease at some point in time. We saw the divorce rate, and Holly explained again why that number I think is a little bit low on the outreach interviews, but we saw a divorce rate of 34.1 in the sheltered self-reported side. We saw 46.5 in the interviews that we did through outreach. Domestic violence, look at that number. Of the sheltered interviews, this is perpetrated or experienced domestic violence was 19.3% of individuals as compared to 43.5% of the individuals that we surveyed in an outreach setting. Jail time. 5.9% of individuals in that sheltered interview said that they had ever been jailed for anything, whereas 63% of our individuals in an outreach setting had been jailed for something. There's a lot of individuals in this community who have been doing jail time for camping in public, trespassing, those kind of tickets, and we see this reflected in these numbers right here. Prison time, so something that's going to be a little bit longer, a little bit harder, more of a felony conviction, 1.5% on the sheltered survey, 30.5% for our unsheltered individuals. When we look at mental health, these numbers are pretty dramatic as well. Now, this is dramatic for two reasons. One, there's still a big difference, but two, I want you to notice that a lot of people, the vast majority of people, more than half in both sides, struggle with mental health issues. And we need to increase mental health services in this community for our sheltered, our unsheltered population, and we need more mental health services regardless of income levels and education levels. So depression, 69.6% of the people that took that self-assessment sheltered survey compared to 85% of our outreach interviews. Those reporting anxiety were 68.9% of the online interview as compared to 80.5% of our outreach interviews. And then other mental health diagnoses. So this includes things like bipolar, schizophrenia, those kind of issues. 32% of our self-reported assessments online reported that, whereas we had 57.5 in our outreach surveys. So mental health is a huge piece and component to this connection with the ACEs data.
On the medical side of things, there were also some pretty significant gaps. For sheltered surveys, we saw 11.1% that have dealt with cancer, 13% on outreach. For liver disease, 5.2% on the sheltered side of things, double that, 12.5% on the outreach side of things. Those reporting high blood pressure, 21.5% of those sheltered, 41.5% of those on outreach. Those who've dealt with STDs or STIs, 11.9% of those that are sheltered, 20% of those that are on outreach. And some of those numbers can be very underreported too, because that is a very embarrassing thing to often admit to. And so we do know that some of those numbers are underreported. For diabetes, 8.9% reported for sheltered individuals, 13.5% on outreach.
Which I would also argue is probably a little low because there's a lot of undiagnosed high blood sugars, diabetes in our unsheltered and our outreach population.
Yes. And then for those who have dealt with a stroke, only 0.7% of those that are sheltered and 14% of those on outreach have experienced a stroke.
Okay, so this slide is the one that gets me, okay? So I want you to look at childhood poverty, ACE score with poverty, positive people with poverty, and adult poverty. Okay, so we pulled out just those individuals that said that they had experienced childhood poverty. So this was just people who said they had an ACE of childhood poverty. 21.5% in our sheltered survey, 51.5% in our outreach interviews. Now, when we look at just the individuals who had a poverty issue with their ACEs, right? A poverty identification with their ACEs. The ACE score jumps in both situations. Do you see that? So the sheltered surveys with just our individuals who said that they had experienced poverty as one of their ACEs, it went from 2.5 as the average to 4.78. We also see that same jump with our outreach interviews. Their overall score was 5.38, but when we isolated just the people who identified childhood poverty, that overall ACE score jumped to 7.1. Why is that? Because we know that there is a connection between a lot of these ACEs and traumatic events and poverty. And we see a lot of intersections with these things, a lot of increased incarceration, increased substance abuse, just like we showed with these numbers. Those aren't, assumptions. Those are things where we see documented trends. We see those connections that are being made. Here's the thing that I want you to look at. Look at that number of positive people. So for those individuals who had childhood poverty, it went from a 9.86 average for our sheltered survey all the way down to 5.5. It was cut almost in half when we isolated poverty. We see a little bit of a dip, not quite as much, but it didn't have very far to go. When we look at our other side, our outreach interviews were showing 1.58 average number of positive people, but when we just looked at childhood poverty, that number dips to 1.28. Why does that matter? Why is that happening? Why is that important? That's the heart of this whole conversation, is because I think we see this trend that is emerging from this research that shows us that children and families that are existing in poverty, that we have this generational piece that is starting to happen. And you see this when you look down at these numbers, because if you look at adult poverty, right? Those that are sheltered, those that still had at least 5 positive people in their life, they had some degree of a support network. It may not have been quite as big as others, but it was still significantly larger than those that are currently unsheltered or in an outreach situation. You only see a small increase, a 7% increase, from 21% who experienced childhood poverty to 28% experiencing adult poverty. But you see a doubling of those individuals we interviewed in an outreach situation. 50% of them grew up in childhood poverty with only one positive person in their life on average. That number doubled as we went throughout that they all experienced some degree of poverty in their adult life. And that is the number that just absolutely grabs a hold of me and says, Springfield, like, we've got to pay attention to this. We've got to look at how this data needs to impact everything that we're doing. So I want us to talk for just a few minutes. I know I'm giving you lots of information, but I want to share some more facts and figures with you about why this data matters. And then I want to open this up to conversation and questions and discussion. So I want you to kind of start with us, Holly, and talk a little bit about why this data matters.
So yeah, Springfield, Missouri is, most of us probably are aware of this. We have a very, very high poverty rate. It's actually over double the national poverty rate. So our poverty rate in Springfield is 22.9%. The national average is around 13%. 1 in every 4.7 community members are living in poverty. So almost 1 in 5 are living in poverty. The Springfield childhood poverty rate is crazy to me and heartbreaking to me. Springfield is known as having a very large children population. We have a lot of families that live in the city. Some of that is due to the fact that we have a low cost of living. There are families that have moved to Springfield to exist in a place where they can hopefully survive a little bit better. Children under 6, 30.4% of our kiddos that are 6 and under are living in poverty here in Springfield. Children that are between the ages of 6 and 11, so this is a lot of our elementary age kiddos, there's 34.6% of those kiddos that are living in poverty. For adolescents, so 12 through 17, middle high school kiddos, there is 23.2% of those living in poverty.
And this is census data, for those of you that may be wondering where these numbers are coming from. These are census data numbers.
Mm-hmm. And that's a lot of why we've seen especially our Title I schools, our north side Springfield schools, where we see a lot of that poverty rate really kind of living together, we see a lot more programs. We've seen a lot more outreach being done inside of our schools to try to reach these kiddos by providing free meals to them and food and clothing banks and things like that, because we have such high numbers of kids in poverty. So the national average, if you compare these rates for childhood poverty, which was around the same for all these age groups, was 16%. So we're almost double that in most of those age groups of the kids that are in our city living in poverty. Springfield has estimated 1,035 individuals living without permanent shelter in our community. And I just want to pause and let you know there are a lot of different ways that we try to track poverty. So the city has a very specific government ordained kind of way of tracking poverty. It's usually a singular event that they do. Tracking homelessness, sorry, not poverty, homelessness, once a year, where they try to go out in the community and find those that are homeless. And they will admit, those who do that data survey, that it is an underreported number, because it's hard to track down all of our individuals who live in our cities. So we do our own tracking just because we interact daily with so many people who are unsheltered. And so our number is higher. So, and this number, when we were trying to put this together, Chris even said this number has increased since this exact number was measured. But we determine people who are homeless or houseless as people who do not have their own place of residence. So this is families and individuals who are living in their cars, living in hotel rooms. They may be bouncing back and forth between individuals. We do know that the number of families living in our city who are considered homeless by HUD standards, so families that do not have their own place of shelter, is incredibly underreported, because many of these families try to fly under the radar. They're so terrified of losing their children to the system. Many of them do couch surf, and so they are considered sheltered by school standards and by government standards, and so they may be living in the house of somebody that is a partner of that parent. It may be a family member, a friend, a neighbor. So we do know that number is incredibly underreported and really hard to track, because it's hard to be able to get the amount of people that are living in poverty or living homeless. So we have over 1,000 individuals on our streets or in our cars or in our hotels that have no place to go at this time. At any given time, we have between 600 to 800 children in the foster care system here in Greene County. And we're leaning on the 800 side of things since COVID, since after the COVID shutdown happened. And almost all of these families are living in poverty. And I will just tell you that because this is the work that I do every single day. I don't have an exact statistic, but one of the statistics I was given by Children's Division is there's around 80% of our families in the foster care system that are there for poverty-related issues. So it's going to be situations where families are homeless, there's drug use in the home. We have a very high drug use problem in our poverty individuals in Springfield. It's gonna be domestic violence situations and unsafe individuals, where maybe a single parent dropped off a kid with grandma because she has to work full-time and she can't afford childcare, but grandma was, put that kid around someone unsafe and that parent was deemed unprotective. It's those kind of circumstances. And so almost 80% of our families have a goal of reunification and the potential to reunify, but they're existing in a place of separation because of poverty-related situations.
So I'm a big believer that we have to connect all the dots to solve the problems, right? So one of the dots that I want us to connect to this conversation of why does this data matter to our community is the economic impact of trauma, the economic impact of ACEs. So we have seen numerous national and international studies that have been done that have tried to measure the socioeconomic cost of ACEs. And the CDC estimates that the socioeconomic cost of ACEs on any given community is incredibly high, averaging about $428 billion a year nationally. Wrap your head around that for just a second. That is an immense amount of cost that we are shouldering and we are carrying as communities. That is on our healthcare system, that is on our legal system, that's on our law enforcement, that is social work, that is all of these different components that are coming together. And so back to the very beginning when I read you that quote, that was by the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and he says, trauma, ACEs, this is the #1 unrecognized healthcare problem in America. And I'm gonna add to that, and I'm gonna to say, I think it's the #1 issue that communities face, period. But we often don't recognize it as trauma. We often label it a bunch of different things. We talk about it in the form of crime. We talk about it in the form of domestic violence. We talk about it in the form of homelessness or poverty, or we talk about it in the form of addictions. But what we've got to recognize is all of those individual issues have a common root. And if we as a community could start to address that common root, we can change things dramatically. And we can put ourselves as a community and as a country in a much better economic standpoint. Imagine what it would look like if we could reinvest a lot of those resources into mental health capacities, increased resources for our community. So here's another piece of why this matters, and that is because we know that higher the ACE number, the lower the educational levels and the lower the income potential. So again, if we're trying to break a cycle of poverty and we can't seem to understand why those numbers aren't budging and those numbers aren't moving, we've got to understand all of these different components that we've been talking about today. We've got to recognize that we see higher instances of poverty in adulthood and increased job loss and frequency of job changes the higher that our ACE scores go. And so when we hear things at the outreach center all the time from people who say, why don't they just get a job? Why don't they just do this? If you're not looking at that through a trauma-informed perspective to understand that what we have gone through, we continue to carry, especially if we never deal with it. And if we continue to carry that, it becomes harder and harder to function in any source or fashion of what we, traditional society, right, sheltered society, would call normalcy. And holding down a 9-to-5 job is part of what a lot of people would call normalcy. And we tend to project that onto people who are struggling, and we fault them that they're struggling in that space. So here's a few other pieces. I'm going to show you some charts. These may be kind of hard to read from where you are, and I apologize for that. But like I said, these are going to be up on our website here in just a few minutes when we're done. But mostly what I want to show you, and we'll kind of point this out as we go through a few of them, is some of these issues in connection to national statistics. You'll notice that some of these statistics are a few years older. They're census statistics. They're different things like that. Some of our data gathering has really been impacted because of COVID. So we're having to go off of some numbers that are 2019, 2018. What I want you to hear then is that my guess, my assumption, and I feel pretty confident saying that, almost every number we're going to talk about is probably higher now than it was, because we know that poverty has been greatly increased worldwide because of COVID. So I'll let you talk about this first one.
So back in 2019, which the statistics we already went over were actually a more recent statistic, those 34%. In 2019, based off of census data, 24% of children were in poverty here in Springfield. The national average at that time was 19%.
So here's an interesting one for us. There's a lot of talk in Springfield right now about our crime rate. So if we look at violent crime rate, the national average is 431.9% of violent crime incidents. In 2019, when this data was collected, Springfield had 1,539 violent crime incidences. So these included murder, aggravated assault, robbery, forcible rape. And so I want you to see there's this huge difference where Springfield is way over the national average in this area. And these numbers came from the FBI, Uniform Crime Reporting Division.
One of those incredibly common negative outcomes we see for people is a common health problem, which is the occurrence of smoking in an adult's life. On average, we have about 16.7% that report smoking here in Springfield, or 21.7% report smoking here in Springfield. 16.7% is the national average.
So here's another interesting number where we see this poverty issue come into focus, and that is income inequality, okay? So this is an American Community Survey that was done in 2019, looks at, and it was given that the average was a -9 across all of these cities, okay? So income distribution was kind of skewed anyway to a -9 between most communities. Springfield's income inequality was -36.7. And so we have this large skewing that's happening because of this incredibly high poverty rate that we see in Springfield. Okay, two more of these.
This is titled Frequent Mental Distress. So this could be mental illness. This could be experiences of anxiety, of just feeling very overwhelmed. National average is about 14% of individuals experience feeling this way. The description for this was feeling this way for 14 days during the past 30 days. So a significant amount of time, and this is for adults. Our average is about almost 4 percentage points higher than that. 17.7% of adults feel frequent mental distress over half of the month.
And this last one is looking at our uninsured number. So again, 2019, this data was collected, but it was talking about how the average for a community was about 10% that were uninsured as a whole. At that point in time, Springfield was 15.7%. So again, just these big places that we see these gaps. And when we start to look at, sometimes we read a study and we read data kind of by itself in isolation, and we're like, oh man, that doesn't seem that bad, right? Or, oh wow, that's interesting. And we kind of let it go. But one of the things we wanted to do today was to pull a lot of these different pieces together, because sometimes when we look at things holistically and we see them all together, we start to go, oh, I see this. I see the connections. I see what we need to do here. So recently, one of my favorite theologians, and he was very much a public theologian. He was a pastor and kind of just a religious figure from the 50s and the 60s. He really helped to shape and influence the civil rights movement. He was somebody that counseled and gave wisdom and counsel to Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis and others. But it was Howard Thurman. And I firmly believe that Howard Thurman was way ahead of his time. He writes about a lot of things that he never uses the language of trauma-informed language, but he sure alludes to a lot of things that kind of like, I see something here. And one of the things that he talks about in the connection of community is to be free means the ability to deal with the realities of one's own situation so as to not be overcome by them. Do you hear that? This idea that in community, if we want to have freedom in our community, it means that we have to have the ability for all people to deal with the realities of their situation and not be overcome by them. And I think what I want you to see from this data today, and the whole reason that we're kind of laying all this out there, is because there are a lot of our neighbors in this community who are not able to overcome the situations of their own realities, whether it was the past, and that past has carried with them into the present, and it is limiting what they can do in the future. It is limiting what we as a community can become in the future together, because I'm a big believer that we should not be defining the success of our community by our most successful, most wealthy, most powerful member. We should be defining the success of this community by the person who is the least of these, the person who has struggled, the person who's been on the streets for 10 years, the person who doesn't have access to healthcare or income, and their day-to-day existence should really define our success level for us as a community. So I want to kind of process with you really quickly, because some of you may not be aware. Everything that we've ever done here at TCG, from day one, we said that we wanted to be a trauma-informed church plant, that we wanted to create spaces and outreaches that used this kind of data to help shape what we do. And so I'm gonna let Holly talk really, really briefly about Family Connection, and then I'm gonna touch on a couple of others, and then I just wanna highlight a few of the gaps that I think we see in our community where we can use this data to fill them.
Yeah, like I shared, Family Connection is a program that I get the privilege of running, where we supervise visits for families that are inside the foster care system. We work alongside Children's Division, so we work alongside the system to support these families. We operate because there is such a high degree of families in our system, and such a high degree of families that are in our system because of poverty-related issues, which ultimately comes down to people who don't have support systems, people who don't have people that they can call when things get bad. They don't have people who believe in them, who've helped give them the chance to heal from their own childhood traumas, and now they're raising children often in trauma situations. We felt very led to start something that would utilize buildings that are free, safe spaces. So we opened church buildings. Ours was the first one to host these visits for, and then we train community members. So this is a volunteer-based level of getting involved with these families, where you come volunteer every week, every other week, and you work with the same family every single time. You get to love on them. We get to build relationships with them. Part of this is that positive people perspective. These kids need more positive people, and we get to be that for them. I can't even tell you how exciting it is for me to walk into our building and one of our kiddos runs up to me and is like, guess what? I scored a goal at my soccer game. Like, I just wanted you to know. Like, those places are so sweet and so special, and to be able to sit with them during really hard moments when sometimes they have to talk to their parents about decisions they want, outcomes they want to have happen, and having other people there to tell them, like, you're validated, that you feel this way, like, you're seen, you matter. On the other side of that is being safe people for these adults, these parents who are working really hard to overcome the barriers that they've experienced, oftentimes some of the barriers they've put their own children into, and they're trying to do the work to overcome this kind of stuff. And they just need people who can just listen, people who can say, hey, I don't have to operate in a professional manner around you. I can be a support for you. I can listen. I can let you vent. I can be a safe person to hug you and let you cry. I can help you process what you want to do with your life, where to go, where do you go to get this out. I even get questions all the time. I don't understand this process of the system, and I'm too embarrassed to ask my caseworker, can you help me? And just getting to be at that safe level with someone, that you get to be someone who just believes in them, even when time and time again they don't believe themselves, is a really special opportunity. So we started this program several years ago. We've also now expanded where we have multiple sides of that, and I won't get into all the details, but we're working on the preventative side to try to keep some of these families out of the system. We do aftercare when families reunify. We actually go in and follow them and stay connected with them and support them, so they do have, we can be the people they call in the middle of the night when they need something, when they have an option if things get really challenging. And we're also providing some parental support now. So really getting to, we're starting a brand new class, kind of a support group program here in March for some of these families, where they can come and just have more positive people that help them